Festival. We are organizing this in collaboration with SPUI 25. Our festival has not started yet. It will take place. It will start tomorrow and take place from 25th of October until the 4th of November. So I hope this program will give you a little bit of a taste of what we have in mind. We are a festival of genre films, so horror, fantasy, and science fiction. But don't let that scare you off if that's not normally what you watch. We are mainly a festival about imagination. So that can be it can be so many things. But one of the things that we will talk about this year is the theme, Fantastic Alchemy. And it's our interpretation of alchemy, which we imagine as this gray area between science and imagination. So this can take marvelous forms. In film, we see this a lot, but it can also have some darker expressions, which is what we will talk about today. One of the things that I wanted to tell you today is, as you might see, well, on the beginning slide that we had, there's one speaker lacking today. Unfortunately, he had to cancel due to circumstances, but we will still have, I think, a very good conversation with the speakers. There will be some clips of a film that we are going to screen during the festival. The film goes into much more depth about a specific book we will probably discuss a little bit later. But we will take this discussion much further than that. But if you want to learn more about the topic, then go and watch the film. It will be screening on Monday the 30th of October at 5 o'clock in the Filmhalle and Friday the 3rd of November in Lab 111. So the conversation today will be led by Julius Koetsier, who is the editor-in-chief of Schokkend Nieuws. It will take about half an hour, and after that, there will be time for questions. So, I think this is my cue to invite Julius Koetsier on the stage.
Hello, everyone. It's always awkward when the applause is over long before I've reached the stage and there's just this silent walk to my chair. I am Julius Koetsier, the editor-in-chief of film magazine Schokkend Nieuws. We're today going to discuss conspiracy theories. And the reason for us being here is the fact that Imagine is showing the film Satan Wants You, which is a documentary about a non-fiction book about a woman named Michelle Proby, written by her and her psychiatrist, Lawrence Preston. She was. I'm just briefly going to tell you what the film is about, and then I will invite the Dr. Sarah Polak up on stage to discuss. But it's good to first get an idea of what the film is about. It's about a woman who she was seeing this psychiatrist because she was suffering from depression. And during these sessions, she was under hypnosis, and she discovered that she had these suppressed memories of satanic ritual abuse from her childhood. And this psychiatrist thought this was very interesting and wrote a book about it that became a bestseller called Michelle Remembered. And Michelle Remembers. And this in the 80s in America was a huge book. Every mainstream talk show had these people on, as we'll see in the clips we're going to show. Of course, then it turned out things weren't really as scary as it seemed, or perhaps even scarier. That this Lawrence Preston and Michelle had been having a very inappropriate relationship for a psychiatrist and patient. They were crossing boundaries. They had started a romantic relationship during the sessions, and they had a sort of codependent relationship where she was very happy to have someone who believed all her stories, and he was very happy to have someone who he saw as his gateway to fame. And that is the story that is sort of revealed in that documentary. And the book was one of the most important starting points of the Satanic Panic of the 1980s, which swept the United States. We're going to be talking about the Satanic Panic and later conspiracy theories with, from Leiden University, Dr. Sarah Polak. There she comes. Hello.
Hallo.
Welkom.
Ja.
Is there anything? Have you seen the film? I assume
have,
so.
yes.
Have you anything you want to say about it, or should we just first watch a clip?
Let's maybe just first watch a clip.
Yeah, let's do that.
In 1981, there was an American Psychiatric Association annual meeting, and Pastor talked about the content of Michelle Remembers, and he started generalizing that there was this phenomenon, you know, beyond that particular story, that there was a phenomenon called satanic ritual abuse.
Satanic ritual abuse was a theory that people took as a fact, that there's a satanic conspiracy and there are children who are kidnapped or stolen and sacrificed.
Children are involved in graveyards and crematoria, in funeral parlors, because one of the primary focuses of these people is death. Everything is attempted to be destroyed and killed in that child, and in society, everything of goodness.
That was Dr. Lawrence Pastor, the psychiatrist who's the co-author of that book. Do you know much about what can you tell me about the Satanic Panic beyond what we've just seen?
So this is, in some ways, told in the documentary, I think, is a very somewhat individual story on some level about this problematic love relationship between this woman and her psychiatrist. But it's also, in a broader sense, as you just said, a massive wave of national panic that people had about their children being stolen by Satanists and exposed to these awful, completely gruesome, unimaginable satanic ritual abuse. So it was something that for a while people were extremely scared about happening. And in some ways, you can think about it as a little bit like the Red Scare of the 1950s, when there was this massive wave of fear of people being communists and uncovering communists. And in some ways, if you denied you were a communist, that could often be understood as proof that in fact you were a communist, or you were gay. That could be interpreted as pink is kind of like red. And so this is something kind of similar that happened in the 1980s. So a wave of societal fear about Satanism. And I think it's triggered in some sense by this book. But it's also, it wasn't, Satan played a big role and was often mentioned, but it wasn't necessarily really about Satan. It was like a fear of something broader and harder to pinpoint.
And what would that have been?
I think it's something that lived primarily in the 80s in conservative Christian America, although it really spread across all parts of society. But it's really kind of originally the Pastor and Michelle Smith, or Prody or Pastor, whatever she calls herself, different names at different stages, are Catholics, and also really see this as kind of a way to promote Catholicism. She has saved herself, or is saved in a sense by this figure that she recognizes as Mary in her supposedly recalled traumas. And I think that it's in some sense part of the early 1980s, late 1970s backlash to the 60s and 70s and all of the large emancipatory movements like feminism and gay rights and Black civil rights and so on. So I think it's a sort of a counter response, and this is actually kind of one part of that, of this sort of fear of sin and Satan being among us and, corrupting us from inside.
Yeah, because just to be clear, there was no evidence of this whatsoever, right? There was no satanic ritual that's ever been... But there was, of course, this pre-existing
cultural notion of Satan and a popular cultural idea, and even, you know, a satanic church that didn't do these ritual or abuse rituals, but that had kind of, as part of the 70s and also New Age movements, really embraced this idea of
the Church of Satan.
You know, Satan, the Church of Satan as some kind of freeing,
which were
liberating.
atheists who didn't worship the devil, but
Yeah, but you know, styled themselves on some level, and of course this is also true of some styles of music that these, you know, people who thought they were fighting satanic ritual abuse were very afraid of. And I think that's a very much, you know, like even decades before, when the Beatles first appeared, there were people saying, you know, is this really music? And this is a kind of, you know, reiteration of that same thing in the 1980s after the 60s and 70s.
Let's look at the other clip then.
Up until 1983, I was not aware of any of these cases. And then it just began to grow and grow and grow. And I kept hearing about more and more of these cases. And I'd say, man, this is some weird stuff. This is some really serious, heavy-duty stuff here. I didn't know what to call it. I didn't say, wow, that's satanic ritual abuse. I just heard people start to refer to these kinds of cases as satanic ritual abuse. And it touched a nerve. Satanic, I knew those people were involved in all this stuff. And ritual, oh yeah, what's that? That sounds sinister and evil.
And in Quantico, Virginia, Special Agent Kenneth Lanning of the FBI.
I became an FBI agent in 1970, and I was a regular FBI agent for 10 years. Eventually, I was assigned to the FBI Behavioral Science Unit. And I became the Bureau's expert on Satanism, the occult, cults, the whole package.
Special Agent Lanning, I'm going to ask you to deal first with the belief, which is quite widespread out there now, that there are just too many people telling too many stories that all sound the same for this not to be true.
So this is all pretty mainstream, right? Mainstream newspapers, mainstream media, FBI actually having people specialized in this. How does it become such a mainstream phenomenon?
Yeah, in part, I think because of changes in what you could call the media ecosystem. So there's all of these TV shows that are syndicated throughout the country, and it becomes much easier to make and spread your own, you know, videotapes or papers, or so there's a real sort of intensification of, you know, news that goes around and that goes to different corners of the land. And also this is something, as you could hear, something that a lot of psychologists and psychiatrists believe in and hold conferences about, and that spreads to, you know, neighborhood work and police work and all of these kind of corners of and schools and so on. There's this sort of idea that that this is a real thing and it's everywhere. And what I thought was interesting in this is that at the very end, you know, the woman, I don't know if you heard, but the journalist says, you know, all these stories are so similar that they must be true. And of course, with hindsight, we see this, we give the same argument for the reverse, right? For the fact that, you know, there's this story that Michelle remembered in this book that psychiatrists throughout the country and police officers and so on have read and have been told about, and then they interview these often very young children about supposed experiences that they may have had, and they insinuate, sometimes using hypnosis, but also, you know, insinuate because a young child will often, you know, answer what you want to hear. These exact same stories, and so but it has a kind of reinforcing effect, and I think in part, and that is also what the FBI guy explains, I think very well, is, you know, it somehow touches a nerve, these stories, and it's really scary, and it's something that we are fascinated by, and that we so I think a lot of the people also who were very much fighting satanic ritual abuse were in a sense drawn to it by also a fascination with it. And I think so part of it is also that it is just very intriguing in the same way as conspiracy theories currently are often very clickbaity. You want to know more about this story because it has something that touches a nerve about it.
Well, that's a good leeway to get to the third and final clip about history repeating.
But the thing that really scares me is that, as people say, if you don't study history, you're doomed to repeat it.
We're not covering Pizzagate enough to expose the Satanism and the occult.
We have these strange allegations now of Pizzagate and things like QAnon, the idea that thousands and thousands and thousands of babies are missing. You know, it's all sort of coming up again.
QAnon, with its claim that Satan-worshipping pedophile elites are running our lives.
Oh boy, here we go again. I mean, that's exactly what I thought. Oh no, not again.
Man showed up at that pizza parlor with a gun, demanding to know more. And now this has become the center of a national debate over fake news.
I came to realize this story is one of the most relevant topics that you could ever talk about in today's world. It's just not about satanic ritual abuse of children, but this problem of what people believe when there's no real objective professional evidence of it is an amazing thing to behold.
It's not going to go away. I used to think it was. I used to think, well, all you have to do is debunk this stuff in a rational way, and I'll just be a good journalist and I'll do that, you know. And it just happens again.
Yeah, we are experiencing similar kinds of conspiracy theories and stories about dark rituals, but I think there are also some differences with back in the 80s.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it's less. I mean, a lot of the accusations are somewhat similar, but it's very much politicized in the sense that Q, the supposed main character of Q, called QAnon, of the QAnon conspiracy, or sometimes it's seen as a cult, actually.
Yeah, Q is the supposed
in government insider. Who is working on a plan to overturn the deep state and who sends out these things called Q drops that give information about this. And and one of the main accusations is that you know, the Democrats in particular are also holding these kind of satanic abuse rings. That is also what the Pizzagate story is about. That was supposed to be in the cellar of this pizza place that doesn't have a cellar and has nothing to do with it. It was a. But what's interesting about these Q drops, and I think also is a clue to understanding the Satanic Panic of the 1980s, is that it's really closely linked to this new changing media ecosystem. So the big world of social media platforms that allow for a kind of play, a kind of collectively, you know, trying to find meaning in these very vague, very confusing, but also worrying Q drops. And so there's a sort of, I mean, and when I say play, that sounds maybe lighthearted and non-serious, but I think, you know, this is obviously a very serious phenomenon. But there is a kind of, in the same way as the satanic ritual abuse stories are often very fascinating and engaging, however also upsetting they are. And I think something is similarly true for QAnon, that it's something that is like a world you can pursue and where there's so much, you know, information that you can find and people that you can find. And this sense that, you know, this is a cult of people or a group of people who are in the know about the deep state and will eventually overturn it. And it has all of these things like where we go one, we go all, and the storm is coming. And that's really, you know, really is really one of the key things that has led, for instance, to the Capitol insurrection on January 6, 2021. This idea of people who were part of this storm, supposedly, that had been predicted, but also called into existence by Q.
Yes. You talk about the play of it. We just saw a clip of Alex Jones, the famous American pseudo-journalist, InfoWars.
Yeah.
I think he is very intentionally being very silly.
Yeah.
A lot of the time. Is that also what you mean by that play? That he is performing and intentionally being ridiculous in order to...
Yeah. Yeah. So, and what is interesting about it is that it is indeed often very engaging, even in spite of yourself, right? I think that's part of why I study this is also part of why you are here. Maybe is also that there is something, whether or not you believe it, you can believe it or not believe it, and find it very interesting. And so there's also, I think, the this documentary shows, or film shows it very nicely, that there's also really a kind of obvious commercial interest underlying this. This is something that is going to, a book that has made a lot of money, and it's been very good for the power and influence of the Catholic Church. And I think similar forces, are in play. Pun intended, I suppose, but here that there's something, it gives people something to play with, but there's also really an earning model underlying it. And I think Alex Jones captures that to perfection in some ways. He's very good at he's not just a believer himself, maybe in conspiracies. I don't even know whether he believes it, but he's a very apt kind of conspiracy entrepreneur, you might say.
Yes. He's also, I think, good at reaching his target audience, which is people who are maybe at first laughing at him. But I sort of think of it like those Telcel infomercials you used to get.
Yeah.
Where you think, how can someone be so gullible to be interested in this? But they are intentionally dumb because they are aiming for the most gullible audience. Would you say that's true for Alex Jones as well?
I definitely think that is part of it. But I also think that there's you shouldn't underestimate how many people believe in conspiracies in America, but also here. And in part, I think some of the reason for that is that there also are conspiracies. The government in the United States has not always been that trustworthy and has done things like, try to derail Martin Luther King's marriage when he was becoming a threat to the current white supremacist order in southern states. So I think, there's lots of examples of the government being in one way or another untrustworthy. And there's a long-standing tradition in the US of government being untrustworthy anyway, as a kind of basic, kind of default setting of the culture. And then there's this sort of Christian belief that the bad and the subversive is already inside us and is about to attack us from the inside. And so all of these things, resonate with the sort of things that QAnon taps into. So, maybe it needs a degree of gullibility, but it also, there's also a real sense that this is tapping into something that is really there. Even if it isn't actually true, it's there in a lot of the, in the cultural fabric, in a lot of television series, in a lot of, other big references in music and in culture broadly.
Is there a profile of the sort of person who is likely to fall into this downward spiral, I'd call it, of conspiracy theories?
I mean, there's definitely particular conspiracy theories that particular people are more likely to believe in. But there's also, but I think one thing that is interesting in particular about the Q conspiracy theory is that it's almost like, it's like this huge kind of hurricane that eats up all the other hurricanes, right? So it's almost like a meta conspiracy theory. It's like all the conspiracy theories are true. And so it also, I mean, of course, this is a phenomenon that has started with and still lives primarily on the conservative Christian right wing. But within that, I think there is a real breadth of, both in terms of geography and in terms of political interest and in terms of age of believers. I think there's just like one of the things about QAnon particularly is that it's so big that there's something for everyone. There's,
I know all the flat earthers went to QAnon.
Exactly.
Eventually, yeah.
Yeah, and Pizzagate, I mean, Pizzagate was before QAnon, really. It was one of those things that grew into it. And like there's a whole host of and anti-vax, of course, which, has people who are opposed to vaccines because they mistrust the government or because they're very Christian or because they're very... there's very new age, close to nature. There's a whole range of demographies, in a sense, that have become subsumed in part via the anti-vax movement during COVID under QAnon recently.
Yeah. So in the documentary, we see that in the 1980s, it was mainstream media, daytime talk shows. Oprah Winfrey was taking these people seriously. Now, it seems that the mainstream media aren't as... they're not spreading conspiracy theories, mostly. Or, well, I mean, depending on what you would call mainstream media.
Yeah, so I think that's true. And I think that these, as I said, the Red Scare and the Satanic Panic of the 1980s and this new sort of massive conspiracy theory, they tend to coincide with a change in the media ecosystem where the conspiracy theory lives primarily in what is then the new medium. I think also that there's a lot of local radio shows and of course Fox News to some extent that do actually pick up a lot of these things that are, cycled around, pumped around the internet and then are picked up by mainstream media. And the other thing, of course, that you also see a lot, and this is ironic actually, is kind of serious, often liberal media who report at length and have these sort of investigative journalistic deep dives on QAnon and infiltrate the movement. In a sense, the kind of work that they do and the stories that they produce are both like QAnon believers, like the kind of work that they do, go find your own answers on the internet, but from a different position. And those stories, because they also go around, reach a massive audience, are also potentially gateways to you go and look this material up for yourself and you may be drawn in. And I think there's a real ethical issue here also about reporting about these things. If it can also draw people to it. Even though, of course, it's usually intended not to do it, to show how ridiculous it all is.
So what would you advise someone who knows people who are like heading towards this downward spiral of conspiracy theories? Because it's happening to more and more people, and you're sometimes tempted to say, well, I don't want to know that person anymore, but then you think, well, then they get isolated and they'll radicalize even further. What do we do with them?
I find that I think that's a difficult question, and I think that in some cases, like what really doesn't help is often is like fact checking. strangely. And I think that's the journalist in one of the clips also said this. In the last one, I think I'm a journalist, and if I do my job well, people will stop believing this. But the fact that it is disproven by a fact check is often only a reinforcement of the theory. So in some ways, I think the better route is to try and get at what is underlying the fear of Satan. It's actually often not about the devil so much as about another kind of society is changing in a way that really threatens the core of my identity and beliefs. And so if you can get to that, what that is often actually something that one can agree about, or that one can understand, that there is a particular way of life, a particular, white, Christian, family-centered culture, and people feel that their children are morally or otherwise threatened. That is a much easier kind of story to relate to than that this is literally Satan who is literally taking children and murdering them or torturing them, or that's.
Yes, but underlying those beliefs, you'll often find things that are maybe even more shocking. I mean, well, to say about what I saw a YouTube video by Dan Olson about flat eartherism, and he said flat eartherism, what's important to understand about it is that it is a religion, and the fact that the earth is flat is not the most important thing they believe.
Yeah.
But the most important thing they believe is that Jews secretly run the world.
Yeah.
That's underneath there, and that's even more horrifying.
Yeah. I mean,
no,
I can't solve it for you.
I know, but
but I think,
where do we go? Yeah.
Yeah. So I think there is, you can get to an understanding, but of course you can't then really solve that. I think you can't. It's incredibly difficult in any case to really get people to change these kinds of very basic beliefs. I think it's often good to sort of uncover the larger frame of the sort of what is sometimes called a deep mimetic frame, the sort of deep story that is underlying a particular fact or like factoid, like the Earth is flat. But getting people to question that is getting them to question everything they believe, and that's something that it's not something that I'm very open to do. I suppose about the, and I think we have to realize that in American culture, a lot of those deep mimetic frames are about, for instance, white superiority and Jews infiltrating. Those things really are there.
So, do you see a way out anytime soon?
I'm pretty pessimistic. No, I mean, I think one way out is, or one thing that is important, of course, is protecting institutions. And I think it's interesting that the FBI comes away so positively here, because that's not always been the case historically. They have really been involved in actual conspiracies, but protecting institutions is, I think, tremendously important. And they have processes for keeping things working. So yeah, like go vote and go to all of the things where the community is.
One thing that keeps coming back, I'm thinking, is there's always a focus on the children, right? We're seeing that in the satanic QAnon has the hashtag Save the Children, which they sort of took over. It was an existing hashtag, but they took over, and of course with the main sort of conspiracy theory about the trans rights movement is all about kids being
corrupting children.
Yeah. Why does it always come back to the kids? Why is that always where it starts?
I think that is because that is closest to people's heart. That's the thing that the real thing, people with children, which is, of course, a large part of society. What you're most afraid of is something happening to your child being hurt, murdered, corrupted, whatever. I think that's not even specifically American, I would say.
No. Maybe we should open up the floor to questions. Is anyone? Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for your reflections on the topic. How relevant is this experience or these developments you describe? How relevant is this for Europe or for the Netherlands? Maybe you can expand a little bit on that.
Yeah, thank you. How relevant is it for Europe or for the Netherlands? I think I study it primarily in the States, so that is what I have data about. But I think that it is pretty much it is something that is really going on here as well, right? I think and some of that is to do with the fact that the internet is the internet everywhere. It's not exactly the same everywhere, but there's a lot of material that spreads everywhere, and there are also Dutch people interested in, chasing up these Q drops or things like that. And it's not just at that level, but also politicians are looking at each other for these things and are noticing that, for instance, Donald Trump has really gained a great deal by QAnon and belief in those kinds of theories. And so you see, Dutch politicians and Brazilian politicians and everywhere kind of using the same tactics. There is just, I think, in almost every political culture, a faction that has an interest in making people afraid. There's a real sort of political gain to be had. And that's being noticed here too.
Jeanette Ossebaard is one of the most internationally influential people in the QAnon movement. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
No,
Sorry, I should.
No, I was just adding on the Dutch angle. Jeanette Ossebaard is one of the most internationally prominent. She's a Dutch woman who made a documentary. One of the most influential QAnon folks. Is any other questions? Ja, moet je weer. Hou hem maar gewoon daar nu. Dankjewel.
Dan delen wij deze.
Ja.
Dankjewel. Thank you. Well, I want to preface this a bit. I really like conspiracies. I'm really into it. I don't believe all of them, obviously. But I do have a question about one specifically, because I'm not sure how aware you are of this. But the Epstein story was circled around years before any criminal investigations started on these kind of fora. And that turned out to be true. So also maybe a bit like, I think it's a bit of a pity that sometimes you're a bit condescending towards people who are into conspiracies, because sometimes it does turn out to be have some truth to it. So yeah, it's not always, I think, this black and white, like these are stupid people. And also with the Epstein story, it just turned out, of course, we never got a trial, but yeah.
What do you consider to be the Epstein story? Because there's a lot of detail to that.
Well, just in general, that Epstein was this sort of bad guy who went around trying to entice all these young, vulnerable girls to get into this circle and have sex on his island and, on the airplane and the little black book. And it just turned out to be all true.
Of course. There are real child molesters, and Epstein was one, right? I thought you might be referring to the Epstein didn't kill himself. Separate angle of that story.
Yeah, it's a different.
That's a different one, right? Which I think. So I think you're right that there are actual bad guys who turn out to be who are held to account, except that in Epstein's case he was not, because he died before that and presumably he killed himself. And then there's another conspiracy theory about that is kind of part of the QAnon conspiracy, or is kind of taken up in this whole wave, about Epstein being killed by the Clintons or murdered by people who were part of his child sex or sex trafficking ring, and were also in the Democratic Party. And so I think, yes, you are absolutely right, and and this is what makes this difficult. There are actual conspiracies, also, people who are in one way or another involved in the government are involved in those, and the FBI has, on a number of occasions, been involved in those. So I don't at all mean to be condescending about, people in general who question the good faith of institutions, or people, particularly when there is real evidence from historical cases that this needs to be questioned, and it's part also of how democracy works, right? So, but I think, so there's that, and then there is the whole Alex Jones and others, the whole sort of ecosystem of media platforms and politicians who have a real political interest in getting people to believe in as mad conspiracy theories as possible. And it's often actually then one way of recognizing that is that this is sometimes called the new conspiracism, this idea that there's not actually an alternative explanation for what happened. So Donald Trump often said, for instance, a lot of people are saying that this isn't true, but without providing an alternative narrative for what did happen. So it's kind of conspiracy theory, except there is no theory. There is no sense of what really happened. And I think that kind of conspiracism, there's something really wrong here, but we're not going to provide a theory of what. We're not actually investigating any kind of alternative. That is often politically or commercially driven. Could you live with that answer?
Yeah, well, I just wonder who determines where the border is. Like,
yeah.
who says when, well, this is something entirely crazy. And then, of course, there are really people who traffic children and do sex crimes, and on a very large scale. And there's not being that much, well, it's a very opaque subject. So it's not it's not, you don't have to be stupid to be sort of enticed into maybe believing some of the more outrageous stuff.
And there are many cases where it is impossible for all of us, absolutely including myself, to determine what the facts are. Right? There is no, and this is a thing that also comes up in the film, that psychiatrists and psychologists and counselors and so on are very much trained or inclined to believe people, because it's really about them making sense of their experience. And so someone believing you can be sort of affirming and can help you. And police are very trained actually to question what people say. They assume someone is lying, and with all of the problems that gives when someone goes to the police who says they've been raped, for instance. They'll be disbelieved, and so this whole issue about finding out what truly happened is a real problem. How the extent to which we can know that. What I would say as an academic is, there are facts, right? Some things are really true and others aren't, and even when it's impossible to determine. You can also see that there are groups of people who stand to gain by having people believe things. So,
yes, I want to react on what you said and ask a question. Because why should it be necessary to have a border where some things start to be a conspiracy and where it is a fact. Why do we want that? That's the question. And then a comment, you said that psychiatrists, psychotherapists are trained to believe people. I think it's not true. They are trained to be neutral, not to be on one side or another. They have to listen to what people have to say. And that's something else than believing everything. And you said before in the comment on the question of Julius that many psychiatrists and psychotherapists believed in the theories who came up in the 80s. I think that's also not true because most psychiatrists do not believe in that. So not a lot do believe it. It's a small amount.
Yeah. So okay, maybe I agree. There is a generalization involved here that I shouldn't have made. And yet, it's also true that, in particular, the Satanic Panic really was driven by a psychiatrist. And, well, yes, one, but there was also a real, this was everywhere in society. This was, like, people went to jail who, based on children's claims that were actually insinuated to them by, well, in many cases, psychologists or psychiatrists talking to them. And in fact, maybe unintentionally or without meaning ill, implanting also memories in children or just not, or, otherwise, people like Michelle, who as a child had indeed been abused and had very real traumas. And so I think there is a problem or there is an issue around factuality here when it comes to, people being accused in courts of having done these things. And yeah, there's psychiatrists, I'm sure a very small percentage of all of them have had a role in this.
Hi, I have a question. So if I understood you correctly, you said, I think the Catholic Church profited a lot from the Satanic Panic. So to maybe make a grander point, basically it's established systems kind of resisting change. To what extent do you think this is actually working, or is this sort of like a futile attempt to resist it?
I mean, this is a very broad claim, right? These things are stoked by basically conservative organizations or organizations that resist change. I mean, on one level, you can read this as an example of that. There's a whole sideline about, first the local bishop and then, taking this narrative to the Pope. And the Catholic Church really sort of also subsidizing the publication of this book and really kind of buying into this story in part because Michelle remembers being saved by this angelic woman figure who speaks to her in French and calls herself ma mère, and she doesn't speak French apparently, or she claims she doesn't speak French. You can imagine why it would be something that an organization like that is losing membership at the time would want to buy into it. And at the same time, I think there is, we should also be careful with, assuming too much intentionality about this.
I didn't necessarily mean that it was like a concerted effort by the church or anything like that. It's more like these things are happening. So it's maybe society, parts of society resisting this change. Is that effective then? Is this societal resistance against change, like through these conspiracy theories, is this resistance effective? Is basically my question.
My sense is it is. Or it's, I mean, it depends a little bit what you think what you think they want the effect to be. I think quite often, and particularly this is true of the current QAnon cult, they want some kind of change or some kind of radical, or they feel some sort of radical revolution coming, and they maybe want that or are playing with that idea, but what exactly that should be and what the alternative it is that it's then working towards, that is, I think, very open. And I think that is also where I quite like to think of it in terms of play, because quite often, when you are playing, you are bringing something into existence, but not necessarily exactly what it is. And so I think, again, intentionality or the sort of real idea of what it is that it's working towards is often not really there. In the same way as the Capitol insurrection, in the context of the Capitol insurrection, it's quite hard to prove that this was Donald Trump, perpetrating a coup, because it was just like a situation that arose, or some people really planned it and organized it, but there was also enough improvisation in play that it could seem like, or that it really was on some level spontaneous.
Yeah, just on that question of play, and then moving to Canada and the First Nation children. So how do you look at that?
Can you say a little bit more, because I'm having a lot of associations, but can you make the question more specific?
The First Nation children, which are buried near Catholic monasteries where they were supposed to be taken care of, where they were separated from their parents.
Yeah.
So I'm curious on your perspective on that, because you mentioned the word play, but then I get to where do we make a boundary between what's play and what's hurtful?
Yeah.
And how do we move from, I think, an institution which at the core is supposed to bring good, how people then move into cross a boundary in something which in my perspective is bad and evil.
Yeah. Well, yeah, so thank you. I think that's a really fascinating question. I don't think so. There's a big debate in this field that's called play studies about whether play is always good or always positive or cannot also be harmful. That to start with. I think that there's a lot of very serious and dangerous and harmful play going on. At the end, what I find is, so this First Nations children who are buried near Catholic churches and were taken away from their parents, that is something that absolutely really happened. And what I find fascinating in the context of, for instance, the Satanic Panic and QAnon is that there so often is this kind of inversion going on about things that, that really did happen, real, actual conspiracies that did happen, but that happened to people who were already marginalized in all kinds of ways, and then are sort of reinvented, but now projected onto middle-class white children, Christian middle-class white. There's a sort of this is something, a mechanism that you'll often see, for instance, also about, you know, FBI's conspiracies, and also this other big research project where hundreds of black men were injected with syphilis, for instance. Those sort of, that really happened, but that story comes back again and again, with governments, you know, injecting, you know, autism or whatever illnesses, diseases in the white population, particularly our white children. And so I think there's a, yeah, you're onto something here. That is worth studying, I think.
All right, I think that's about it. It's been fascinating. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you, everyone, for coming down. That's it. And go see the film if you have the chance. It's quite good.